With me today, John Dearie, President, Center for American Entrepreneurship. Thanks so much for joining us today, John.
Thanks for having me back. It's been a while. I'm glad to be back.
I think the last time we spoke, we were supposed to have a roundtable here in Tucson as part of the grand opening of the building behind me virtually. And then a little pandemic, and I don't mean to trivialize it, but then the pandemic occurred. You stayed home wisely, as I recall. There was even, I think at that time, so little information that it was a intuitive guess on your part. And, then boy, did we discover afterward exactly what that was.
Yeah. Glad we're through that.
Well, me too.
For the most part.
For the most part, exactly. The fact that I'm overdue to go get my vaccine should tell me all I need to know. And I recall when we had that roundtable, we were able to get a number of really exceptional entrepreneurs together to talk about their experiences and the challenges that they were facing. So here we are, 3.5 years later, almost to the end of 2023. What is the current state of the entrepreneurship landscape in America?
Well, it's a mix of conflicting signals. And in fact, we, CEA just had our annual meeting of the board in Washington last Tuesday and Wednesday, where our whole board flies in. And our meetings are a combination of internal discussions on important topics and then conversations with senior policymakers active on aspects of our entrepreneurship policy agenda. And we began the meeting with that very question. What is the current state of American entrepreneurship? Entrepreneurs have been through a remarkable 3-year period, starting with the aforementioned pandemic and all of the challenges associated with that. The many thousands of businesses that closed over the course of the first 3 to 6 months of the pandemic. Tens of millions of people lost their jobs as the economy was deliberately shut down. And then the very abrupt reopening after we as a country and as a world, sort of found our way through the pandemic and the arrival of the vaccines. The very abrupt reopening and the supply shocks and inflation, the worst inflation in 40 years associated with that abrupt reopening. Then the spike in interest rates as the Federal Reserve tried to fight that spike in inflation. And of course, that spike in interest rates threw off a number of financial institutions around the country, most notably for the innovation community, Silicon Valley Bank, which failed rather dramatically and quickly in March of last year, causing a tremendous amount of anxiety and fear. And there were other, there have been other problems as well in terms of labor shortages, skilled talent shortages, as not everybody who was laid off came back.
Right. Mm-hmm. What are we seeing in terms of the entrepreneurial landscape as far as for example, immigration and the role that it plays in terms of infusing those new ideas and foreign-born founders into our ecosystem?
Well, the need for foreign-born founders, I would say, has never been greater, particularly in the as we work toward the full implementation of the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. These are two of the most significant pieces of innovation and entrepreneurship related legislation that's come down the pike in decades. We need as many innovators as we can get our hands on to implement those two pieces of legislation. And unfortunately, our immigration system continues to be a mess. And it's two dimensions, or at least two dimensions. One is the high-skilled immigration. The other one is the situation that's going on at the southern border. And the chaos at the southern border, of course, is only complicating the overall immigration picture politically. It's just an absolutely irresistible issue politically for Republicans to beat up Joe Biden. I think it's fair to say that the administration has struggled to deal with that situation on the border and the implication of that situation for a number of states and cities around the country. We're all aware, we've all seen the stories, that are going on in New York City and Massachusetts and other cities around the country. It has been our operating thesis at the Center for American Entrepreneurship, and something that we have been pursuing very aggressively in conversations with key policymakers on the Hill, that the passage of the CHIPS and Science Act with significant Republican support creates a new and urgent opportunity for high-skilled immigration reform for the very simple reason that we do not have enough people, skilled talent with the right skills to fully implement the act. The CHIPS and Science Act, of course, is industrial policy. I'm old enough to remember when that term or that idea was ideological heresy for Republicans and conservatives. What brought them over, if you will, is their mounting concern about China as a competitive threat to the United States, and they're right. It should scare them. And so it was our hope that, as significant as that bringing over of a number of even very conservative Republicans to support industrial policy in the form of the CHIPS and Science Act, that it could also be an opportunity for some real progress on the high-skilled immigration front, for the simple reason that if you're going to actually implement the CHIPS and Science Act completely or substantially, you need the right team on the field to implement the game plan, and we don't have it. We have been frustrated with the lack of progress to date. We have been making the rounds, particularly in the Senate, going to all of the relevant, all the offices of relevant folks on the Senate side. The House has been distracted by the Judiciary Committee's hearing on the weaponization of government. They're completely distracted. They're not focused on immigration except for on the southern border. But it remains my hope that the urgency of meeting the competitive threat from China, given the right, sort of movement of the political planets, could present an opportunity for high-skilled immigration reform.
So you already mentioned the CHIPS and Science Act. I'm curious, are there any other policy proposals that are out there that you and CAE have been strongly pushing, advocating for?
There are several. So certainly the full implementation of CHIPS and Science, and that means, first of all, the full funding of CHIPS and Science. CHIPS and Science has been authorized, but there's a difference in Washington between being authorized and appropriated, or fully funded. And we and other organizations around town, innovation, entrepreneurship, technology organizations, have been calling together and very strongly for the full implementation of CHIPS and Science. Also related to that, as I mentioned, focused on high-skilled immigration reform. Another issue that is very urgent that entrepreneurs around the country were sort of rudely reminded of mid-year this year is that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 had an aspect to it. Anytime that there is a major a bill or legislation with far-reaching fiscal implications, there's always a scramble by Congress to figure out or to find what are referred to here in town as pay-fors. How are we going to pay for this? And one of the pay-fors found by members of Congress, particularly Republicans, because it was a Republican piece of legislation, was to change the tax treatment of research and development investments. Specifically, prior to the act, research and development was companies were allowed to expense in the first year 100% of their R&D investments. That got changed to only being able to amortize those expenses over 5 years, and that change, rather cleverly or diabolically, and this is also common in Washington, for unpopular aspects of legislation, it didn't kick in for 5 years. The bill passed in 2017. The first year that this was relevant was tax year 2022. So hundreds of thousands or millions of startups and other companies around the country found out from their accountants about mid-year of this year, like, oh yeah, you know how you thought that you weren't going to have a tax liability this year? Yeah, that's wrong. In fact, you're going to have one, and in some cases it's going to be really big, and in some cases it's going to threaten your existence. And so there has been, understandably, a hair on fire sort of urgency to getting that fixed. And so we and other organizations around town are pushing very hard for this to get fixed by the end of the year. We are also very, very active on a piece of legislation. There's a Senate version and a House version that would reform the Investment Company Act of 1940, specifically Section 3C1 of that act, in ways designed to get more capital to women founders and entrepreneurs of color. I'm sure your listeners are aware that women founders in this country only get about 2% of all equity capital deployed, and entrepreneurs of color get around 1% or even less. And there are reasons for that discrepancy. Some of it are just the limiting parameters of Section 3C1 of that act. The Senate bill is called the Expanding American Entrepreneurship Act, quite appropriately. The House version is called the Improving Capital Allocation for Newcomers Act, or ICANN Act, because everything in the House has to be an acronym in recent years. We're very excited that the bill in the Senate is now bipartisan. It was, both bills in the House and the Senate had been Republican-only bills until about a month ago. Mark Warner of Virginia, a member of the Banking Committee, has decided to sponsor the Senate bill, and we're working very hard to get Democratic sponsorship in the House as well, and hope that it'll pass in this Congress or as soon as possible. Because in our opinion, the current distribution of equity capital is atrocious. It's indefensible. It's un-American. It's immoral, and we need to change it.
Excellent. All right. So let's change gears a little bit. I want to, we work with a lot of entrepreneurs, founders, and so on, and always love to tell the founder story. So one thing I'd really love to hear from you is, what was your motivation in founding CAE, and in particular, what were some of the challenges and successes in the probably challenges in the early days, successes in later years that you like to point to?
So the vast majority of my career was spent in banking and financial policy. I started my career at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York after graduate school. I was there for about 10 years, and then I went to an organization also in New York called the Financial Services Forum, which is a financial and economic policy group comprised of the CEOs of the largest financial institutions in the United States. That group was originally in New York, but when Hank Paulson, who was then at Goldman Sachs, became chair of the forum, he moved the forum down to Washington, D.C., which turned out to be highly prescient. We moved down in the fall of 2005. By the summer of 2006, Hank had been convinced to leave Goldman and become Treasury Secretary. And then about a year after that, Bear Stearns failed and the financial crisis began, which led to the Great Recession, which was really the defining experience of my life. I was working for the institutions that were failing or on the precipice of failure in the middle of the crisis. And then by way of some relationships on Capitol Hill, I got pulled into the policy response that eventually became the Dodd-Frank Act, and got about 20 years of financial experience crammed into about 4 or 5 years. But it was as we were coming out of the Great Recession, which ended in the spring of 2009, the economy started to grow again, that I began to look for it 2 years into the recovery. So by the spring of 2011, the economy began to grow again in the spring of 2009. By the spring of 2011, we were growing, but very slowly. And unemployment, believe it or not, it's hard to even imagine this given where we are now with unemployment at 3.5%, and 10 million jobs open that we can't fill. 2 years into the recovery after the Great Recession, unemployment was still north of 9%. And we just were not getting the kind of traction either in terms of economic growth or job creation that everybody was hoping for. And notwithstanding a Herculean policy response by Congress, we had the big stimulus bills shortly after Obama was inaugurated. The Federal Reserve came in hard and controversially with 0% interest rates and 3 rounds of quantitative easing, et cetera. And we just were not getting the kind of traction that everybody expected. And so I started a major project at the forum to try to come up with new ideas for policymakers, new ways to accelerate economic growth and job creation. What were we missing? I sort of started following my nose through the research of where economic growth comes from, and eventually found my way to entrepreneurship and some research that was new at the time that had been done by the Kauffman Foundation, by John Halterwanger at Maryland, by Ed Prescott at Arizona State, and Leo Hanian at the Stanford Institute or the Hoover Institute at Stanford. All of them were sort of arriving at the same place simultaneously, publishing research showing the following 3 things. One is that new businesses are disproportionately responsible for innovation in the economy. And the reason why that is, there are other sources of existing firms innovate, of course, too, but startups, new businesses are disproportionately responsible for innovation in the economy. And the economics behind that, as we know from the great work of Robert Solow, who won the Nobel Prize for this insight, is that economic growth is driven principally by gains in productivity, driven by innovation, which comes disproportionately from startups. So startups began to be identified by way of new research as being incredibly important to innovation, gains in productivity, economic growth. Very interesting if you're worried about the pace of economic growth. As a corollary, and you're familiar with this, also determined that startups account for virtually all net new job creation, which makes sense if they're responsible disproportionately for what drives economic growth. Third piece of the puzzle that Bob Lighton and Ian Hathaway and others determined is that startup rates in this country had been in decline for 4 decades. I'd never heard that before in my life. Frankly, I didn't believe it. I thought, how could that be? We're the United States of America. We have Silicon Valley. We have Shark Tank. How could it be that entrepreneurship is in trouble? But I called up Bob and called up Ian and did my homework and eventually came to believe it. But then I asked the question, well, why is this happening? Why is the decline in American entrepreneurship happening? If it were true, that would explain if, in fact, startups are as important as the research was indicating they were to innovation, economic growth, and job creation. And if it were true that startup rates were in decline, well, that would explain potentially why all these Herculean policy efforts going on in DC weren't working because policymakers were digging in the wrong place. The question was, why was this happening? And as you'll recall from our previous conversations, I and another colleague decided to find out by getting out of Washington, traveling the country for 3 or 4 months and conducting roundtables with entrepreneurs and asking them very simply, what's in your way? And they told us, and it was the transformative experience of my life and my career. I ended up writing a book about it to report what entrepreneurs had told us and to take a first crack at a policy agenda to respond to what they had told us. And as I was finishing that book, it occurred to me there's no organization in Washington, D.C. dedicated specifically to engaging with policymakers, educating them about these realities, especially that entrepreneurship in America was in trouble, and what to do about it, from a policy standpoint. So after 17 years at the Financial Services Forum, I left. And with Bob Lighton and a whole bunch of other people who agreed to join the board, we launched the Center for American Entrepreneurship.
And I should mention that book was Where the Jobs Are, which I read cover to cover more than once and sent many copies to many people. And any plans to update that or write a new version of it?
It has occurred to me. It takes me it takes a long time to get over writing a book, because writing a book is a tremendous amount of work. It has occurred to me a couple of times since. Frankly, I'm too busy running CAE. If I eventually step away from CAE, which of course at some point I will, that might be the time for me to do an update. But we're so busy trying to stay alive, and with so much to do in Washington, I don't have the bandwidth.
Yeah, I can completely appreciate that statement. I will offer it right here, right now. When you're ready to write that book, give me a call, John. I would love to help maybe write a chapter on some of the interesting parts.
Awesome.
Particularly, so we work with a lot of students. University of Arizona's got 50,000 of them. We also work with community colleges and high school students as well across the state. So let's go back to your educational roots. Were you a finance major? What did you major in?
No, I was more of a concept reading and writing guy. I was always fascinated by the intersection of economics and government. Which some people refer to that intersection as public policy. There is currently I went to Notre Dame, and there's currently a multidisciplinary school called the School of Global Affairs, which was created in 2017. That did not exist when I was there, and so the only way for me to get both economics and government, to sort of do a multidisciplinary curriculum that I was interested in, I double majored in economics and government. When I went to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York as my first job out of graduate school, I then went to, after working for a couple of years on Wall Street, I went back to the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia to do a master's degree in political economy. Same, sort of combination of economics and government. But those degrees for me were a lot of reading and writing. I still have never taken any sort of formal training in accounting or corporate finance. All of that stuff I've learned in the years since. And strangely, I went to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the central bank of the United States, obviously a very important institution with regard to banking and finance. Having never taken an accounting course or a corporate finance course or a banking and finance course. I don't know why they hired me, frankly. So I'm more of a big picture guy and an ideas guy, and I continuously have to struggle to fill in the specific, the blanks of the specific topic I'm studying.
All right, let's jump to one which I think is really the heart of much of what's going on today. So I mentioned, obviously, we work with a lot of college students, and often we have to delineate the fact that at least historically, 97% of students graduate and go on to become an employee. They don't start a company. It's only about 3% of students that actually launch a company out of college. Yeah. And when I talk with people about that, I say, good, that's fine, because I think it's actually important to get out and get some experience in industry to really ground oneself in what are the pressing problems, what are the challenges, how does business work. So it doesn't come as a surprise to you or me, I suppose, if you look at who the typical founder is today relative to perhaps what the stereotype is. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, and my colleague at the Center for American Entrepreneurship, he's on the board and was a co-founder, Ian Hathaway, has written about this quite extensively, and there was a very famous piece in Harvard Business Review about this, that the average age of the American entrepreneur, if I'm remembering correctly, is about 41. It's not, a 22-year-old in a hoodie, notwithstanding the stereotype. There's nothing wrong with being an entrepreneur at 22, but there are certain realities of life, as you just pointed out. Getting the kind of work experience and business experience, corporate experience is important. One grows up and matures and develops all kinds of skills and networks over the time that you're in the conventional aspect of your working career. The other very important thing that people get is money. They establish savings that they can use if they do decide to take that jump. So it's not surprising in a certain sense that, there are clear risks, obviously very significant personal and financial risks associated with being an entrepreneur. So, some of those risks are easier to deal with if you're, your late 30s, early 40s. Other risks are more difficult. As the financial risks, begin to subside a little bit, your life risks, if you will, healthcare, childcare, student debt, retirement security, all of these things that suddenly become very important when you have a family that you're responsible for. Those hurdles become very significant because it becomes very hard to leave that corporate job that's very predictable. You have a salary, you have a bonus, hopefully, you have retirement security. A lot of people have childcare by way of their corporate employers. Most folks have their healthcare provided by way of their corporate employers. Those risks, suddenly become very, very large as you get deeper into middle life. And for that reason, those topics policy work to address those issues are very, very high on our agenda because they're very relevant for American entrepreneurs, particularly women. Who are very concerned, quite naturally, about things like healthcare, retirement security, childcare. Childcare is an enormous barrier to entrepreneurship among women in this country, and we're very active on that issue. So, but yes, you're quite right that the stereotype of the typical entrepreneur is really not particularly accurate.
So you were describing, I think we often call it the social safety net, right? Yeah. This is the all the pieces and to consider what it means to make that leap from steady employment to basically put everything at risk. And then on top of it, we're going to couple things like healthcare and childcare to employment. So what are you seeing in terms of policy that's advancing, whether it's here in the U.S. or outside the U.S., that seems to be exemplary in helping to address that?
Well, on the retirement savings front, there have been two pieces of legislation that are extremely significant in recent years and really great news for entrepreneurs and gig economy workers, and that is the Secure Act. I can't remember what Secure stands for off the top of my head. It is another acronym, and the acronyms are very hard to remember. But the Secure Act and then Secure 2.0. The Secure Act, as I recall, was passed either at the end of 2019 about that, and Secure 2.0 was passed last year. Many Changes in retirement security law, very favorable. And I've got two op-eds on this. If you go to startupsusa.org and you look at the down our website, you'll find them in terms of describing the various changes. But retirement security law has changed dramatically in the last few years and in ways very important for entrepreneurship and gig economy workers. Student debt, obviously the country is very hung up on exactly how to deal with this. It's an enormous obstacle to entrepreneurship. Starting a company is hard enough as it is. It becomes almost impossible if you have several $1,000s of student debt that you have to service every month. It becomes a major obstacle to getting the kind of talent that you need, even if young folks are inclined to go to work for a startup and forego the kind of salaries that they could get if they were to go to other companies, Google, a Google, a Meta, or whatever. Even if they're inclined to do that because they want to work for a startup, they often just can't afford to. So student debt is an enormous issue, both for entrepreneurs and in terms of them being able to get the talent that they need. Childcare is probably the issue that I'm most disappointed about. This country stands in stark contrast to the rest of the world. We're the only G20 country that has no national childcare policy. Childcare in, I believe it's 38 states in the union. Childcare for one child for a year is more expensive than sending a kid to the state university. in 38 states. By the U.S. Government's own definition of affordability, all 50 states fail the U.S. government's own definition of childcare affordability. It is a terrible problem in this country that is not just is not good for families, is not good for kids, is not good for women participating in the workforce. It's really bad for women founders. We have pushed very, very hard for childcare policy. I just accepted an invitation to be on a commission having to do with childcare policy that is going to meet for the first time in November 1st and 2nd in Kansas City, Missouri. Very interestingly, we were talking about earlier the R&D tax credit issue and the need to fix that problem that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act created. Democrats have now tied, and this is what makes it more complicated, but Democrats have tied in recent months fixing that issue with making the child care or the child tax credit permanent, using the urgency of the need to fix the R&D expensing issue with the need to address childcare policy in this country. So we'll see how that turns out. But retirement security, childcare, student debt, and healthcare, of course. Healthcare is a major challenge and obstacle for entrepreneurs that we haven't quite figured out in this country.
Yeah, it's certainly something I hear from a lot of founders who, they have a good idea. They have something that they really want to make their full-time pursuit, but they just can't bring themselves to leave the security of full-time employment. And of course, that then compromises their ability to build the company.
Well, I think we saw that. I think you're exactly right, and we saw the evidence of that, Brian, when COVID shut down the economy. And 20 million people almost overnight lost their jobs due to the shutting down of the economy because of the COVID pandemic. Initially, there was a plunge in new business applications that you would tend to associate with a shutdown of the economy. But then very quickly, like starting in April about of 2020, new business applications began to surge. And that surge in new business applications has continued right through the most recent 6-month period. Not quite as high as the spike in 2020, but far above historical patterns. And I think a perfectly intuitive explanation of that is that when all these people lost their conventional jobs, at those corporations or businesses that shut down all of a sudden in 2020. All these folks who'd been harboring a business idea in the back of their head said, well, it's not like I'm taking a risk. I mean, I just lost my job, so let's do it. And that set off this explosion in new business formation. I mean, a lot of people are still scratching their heads, including me, about the long-term implications. And is this really the inflection point that we've been, waiting for in terms of the 4-decade decline in American entrepreneurship? Have we really turned the corner? I don't think we're quite at the point, to be able to declare victory in that regard. But it's a very, very significant thing. I was very skeptical of that the spike would last, because it was my, guess and understanding is that a lot of this was entrepreneurship of necessity. When you lose your job, you got to do something. And a lot of people started a new business. And it was my expectation that as things settled down and the economy reopened, that you would see, sort of a reversion to the mean, with regard to new business applications. That's not what's happened. And so I think you're exactly right. I think millions of Americans are harboring these ideas in the back of their head. They're chewing on them for years. We're all, it's part of the American, political and economic psyche to be entrepreneurs and to have a dream of striking out on your own. And it's going to be very exciting to see where this spike in new business formation leads.
Well, you've already sort of started to touch on my last question, which is the one I always ask every guest, which is what is your definition of entrepreneurial mindset?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think it's the urge to build. It's the urge to create something new. I think you've got to be, a little bit crazy to do that because it's risky as hell. Those risks vary depending where you are in your life, as we were just talking about. But I think it is part of it's in our DNA, as Americans. The American system of government itself is a profound entrepreneurial undertaking. Our affinity for immigrants, the great history of immigration in this country, the very act of being an immigrant is a profound act, a profoundly entrepreneurial act to pick up your life at tremendous risk to yourself, financial risk and otherwise, leave your family, your language, your culture behind and come to the United States and start from scratch here. There are innumerable aspects of the American experience that are rooted in entrepreneurship. And I think we all, to greater or lesser degree, I certainly felt it, when I left the forum and I wanted to start and build CAE, and you're doing it there at the university. We all have this desire somehow as Americans to build something either for selfish reasons of we're inclined to build a monument to ourselves, or we're just incredibly intrigued in trying to build something new and make a major contribution to the country.
Wonderful, John. Well, thanks so much for your time and in talking with me today. This has been a treat. I confess I am a policy wonk. I love talking about policy and especially thinking about how it can impact and improve not just the lives of entrepreneurs, but then understanding the economic development and implications of those policies on what is really the future of this country and its economic success. So thanks so much for your time today.
Well, thanks for everything that you do to help create and nurture the next generation of entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship, thriving entrepreneurship, I'm absolutely convinced is essential to building the kind of economy, inclusive economy, expanding opportunity, rising wages, job creation, et cetera, that the American people need and deserve. And so thank you for everything that you do there. And thanks for the invitation to come on. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks.